They handed police a note she never wrote. The real one was locked in a safe deposit box. I want to start with that sentence, because for 6 years I carried a specific, unbearable grief about my younger sister's death. A grief made considerably heavier by a single, handwritten note that never once sounded like her. A note I was told represented her own final words, until a routine visit to a bank recently revealed something that fundamentally changed everything I believed about how she actually died. Before I begin, I want to say clearly that this particular story touches on subjects that are genuinely difficult, including sudden loss and the possibility of harm within a relationship. If any part of what follows feels too close to your own experience right now, please take care of yourself first, and know that support is always available. My name is Delphine. I am 41 years old, and 6 years ago my younger sister Camille died, a death that authorities at the time attributed to suicide, based largely on a handwritten note discovered at the scene. A note I never once fully believed she had actually written herself. A suspicion that a recent, unexpected discovery has finally allowed me to properly investigate. I want to tell you about my relationship with Camille first, because understanding our genuine, sustained closeness matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Camille was 3 years younger than me, and throughout our entire lives, we maintained an unusually close relationship, speaking almost daily, sharing details of our lives with a specific, easy openness that I have never quite managed to replicate with anyone else since her death. I remember, throughout our shared childhood and well into our adult lives, a specific kind of shorthand we developed with each other. Entire conversations that outsiders would find nearly incomprehensible, built from decades of inside jokes and shared history. I remember our weekly phone calls, sometimes lasting well over an hour, covering everything from minor daily frustrations to our deepest, most private hopes, a closeness I always assumed, perhaps naively, would simply continue uninterrupted for the rest of both our lives. I remember, specifically, how Camille and I supported each other through our respective early adult struggles, her own difficult first job, my own complicated first serious relationship, each of us serving as the other's first call whenever something significant happened, good or bad. I remember her particular laugh, easily recognizable across a crowded room, and her habit of sending me photographs of ordinary small moments throughout her day. A cup of coffee she found particularly beautiful, a stranger's dog she'd stopped to admire, small evidence of a specific genuine joy in ordinary life that I still think about often. I want to tell you about the specific period leading up to Camille's death, because understanding this context matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. In the 2 years before she died, Camille had been in a relationship with a man named Julian, a relationship that, I want to be honest, always struck me as carrying a specific, uncomfortable quality I could never quite articulate clearly enough to raise directly with her. A persistent unease that I now understand, with everything I've since learned, deserved considerably more serious attention than I gave it at the time. I remember meeting Julian for the first time at a small family gathering, finding him outwardly charming and attentive, the kind of partner who remembered small details and made a genuine effort to connect with everyone in our family. I remember, too, a specific, quieter observation from that same evening, watching him redirect several of Camille's comments during conversation, gently but consistently, in a way that struck me, even then, as slightly controlling, though I told myself at the time that I was likely reading too much into what were probably simply ordinary couple dynamics I wasn't fully privy to. I want to describe this specific unease, because understanding it matters for everything that eventually happened. I remember Camille gradually becoming less available throughout the final year of her life, our once daily conversations growing increasingly infrequent, and I remember noticing, during the handful of visits we still managed together, a particular guardedness in how she spoke about her own life, especially regarding Julian, a guardedness that felt entirely unlike the open, easy communication we'd always shared throughout our entire lives before that specific period. I remember one particular dinner, perhaps 8 months before she died, where Camille excused herself twice to take phone calls she described only as just Julian checking in, a phrase she delivered with a specific tight smile that I noted at the time but didn't press further, understanding, in hindsight, that this small recurring detail likely represented a considerably larger pattern I never fully grasped until it was already too late to address directly with her. I want to tell you about the day I learned of Camille's death, because understanding this specific, devastating experience matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. I received a phone call from Julian himself, informing me that Camille had been found unresponsive at their shared home, and that authorities, upon their initial investigation, had determined her death was the result of suicide, a conclusion supported, he explained, by a note discovered at the scene. I remember that specific phone call with a clarity that still unsettles me even now, Julian's voice carrying a particular, practiced calm that struck me, even through the shock of the news itself, as somehow slightly off, though I couldn't have articulated exactly why in that specific, devastating moment. I remember driving to their shared home in a state of complete disbelief, unable to fully process what I was being told, arriving to find police already present, everything already characterized, apparently, as a settled, straightforward matter requiring no further family involvement beyond simple notification. I want to describe my immediate reaction to this specific explanation, because understanding my genuine, persistent doubt matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded. I remember sitting with this news, in the immediate hours and days following her death, in a state of profound, disorienting grief. But I also remember, even then, a specific, persistent resistance to the explanation being offered, an instinct I couldn't fully articulate at the time but that never once fully quieted throughout the following 6 years. I want to tell you about the specific note that was presented as evidence during the official investigation, because understanding its content and my genuine reaction to it matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. The note, several handwritten sentences on a single sheet of paper, expressed general sentiments of exhaustion and hopelessness, sentiments that, while genuinely painful to read, never once, in my own careful reading, sounded authentically like Camille's actual voice, her specific vocabulary, her particular way of expressing even her most difficult emotions. I remember reading this note for the first time, standing in a police station's small family waiting room, and feeling a specific, immediate wrongness in its language, phrases that felt generic and impersonal in a way Camille, who had always written to me in vivid, specific, deeply personal language throughout our entire relationship, simply never used. I remember mentioning this specific observation to the officer present that day, watching his expression shift into the particular, practiced sympathy of someone accustomed to grieving family members struggling to accept difficult news, an expression that, I understood even then, wasn't going to translate into any genuine further investigation. I want to describe my attempts, at the time, to raise this specific concern with authorities, because understanding this genuine effort and its limited outcome matters for everything that eventually happened. I contacted the detective assigned to Camille's case directly, explaining my specific, genuine doubt regarding the note's authenticity, and I want to be honest that I was told, respectfully but firmly, that the note had already been reviewed and accepted as consistent with the circumstances, and that without additional, concrete evidence, there was little further investigation that could reasonably be pursued. I remember that specific conversation with the detective, his tone genuinely kind but ultimately unmovable, explaining that handwriting can change considerably under emotional distress, and that without any specific, concrete reason to suspect foul play beyond my own sisterly intuition, the department's resources needed to remain focused on cases with more substantial, immediate evidence requiring active investigation. I remember leaving that conversation feeling genuinely dismissed, understanding, with a specific, quiet despair, that my own persistent doubt would likely need to remain something I carried privately without any genuine avenue for further pursuit. I remember, too, a second brief conversation I attempted several months later, calling the same department to ask whether any additional review had occurred, and being told, gently but clearly, that the case remained closed absent any new evidence, a response that, at the time, felt like a genuine door closing on any hope I had of ever properly understanding what had actually happened to my sister. I want to tell you about the following 6 years, because understanding this genuine, sustained period of unresolved grief matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. I carried my specific doubt privately throughout these 6 years, understanding that without any additional evidence, I had no genuinely productive way to pursue my own persistent unease, a grief compounded by the specific, unresolved feeling that I had never truly understood what actually happened to my own sister during her final days. I remember specific anniversaries throughout these 6 years, each one arriving with the same particular, unresolved weight, understanding that I was mourning not simply my sister's death itself, but a version of the truth I had never been able to properly access or pursue. I remember occasional conversations with my own therapist during this period, working through the specific, complicated grief of carrying a persistent doubt that felt, at times, almost like its own separate, ongoing loss, layered directly on top of the original, devastating loss of Camille herself. I remember, too, the specific, careful way I eventually stopped raising my doubt with other family members, understanding, over time, that repeating an unprovable suspicion, however genuine, risked being perceived as an inability to accept my sister's death rather than a genuine, considered concern grounded in my own intimate knowledge of who she actually was. I remember choosing, instead, to carry this specific doubt privately, confiding only in my closest friend and my own therapist, understanding that this particular grief required a considerably more private, patient kind of processing than the more visible shared grief our broader family experienced together. I want to describe the specific circumstances that eventually led to a genuine breakthrough in this long unresolved doubt, because this discovery emerged during an entirely unrelated administrative matter. Approximately 2 months ago, I received formal notification from a regional bank indicating that a safety deposit box registered under Camille's name had reached the end of an extended dormancy period, requiring formal notification to her listed emergency contact, which happened to be myself, information I had genuinely forgotten I was ever listed as. I remember the specific afternoon this letter arrived, an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. The bank's formal letterhead catching my attention among the usual stack of bills and advertisements. And I remember the particular disorientation of seeing my sister's name printed on an official document 6 years after her death. A small, specific reminder of exactly how much administrative and legal residue a person's life continues generating long after they themselves are gone. I want to describe my reaction to receiving this notice, because understanding my genuine surprise matters for everything that eventually happened. I remember reading this notice with considerable confusion, genuinely uncertain why Camille would have maintained a safety deposit box I had never once heard her mention throughout our entire close relationship. Understanding, even as I made the decision to investigate, that I had no specific expectation regarding what I might actually find inside. I remember sitting with this letter at my own kitchen table for several minutes before actually calling the bank listed on the notice, some instinctive part of me already sensing that whatever this box contained likely carried genuine significance, given how carefully and quietly Camille had apparently maintained it, entirely separate from anything either of us had ever discussed during her own lifetime. I want to tell you about the specific process required to access this safety deposit box, because understanding this careful formal procedure matters for everything that eventually happened. Given Camille's death, accessing this box required formal documentation confirming my status as her legal next of kin, along with a court order specifically authorizing access, a process I worked through with an attorney over the following several weeks. I remember the specific weeks of waiting for this formal legal authorization to process, a strange, suspended period during which I found myself returning, again and again, to my own long-held doubt about that original note, understanding, with a specific, growing anticipation, that I might finally be approaching some genuine answer after 6 years of carrying this uncertainty entirely alone. I want to describe the specific moment I finally opened this safety deposit box, because it represents the actual beginning of everything I eventually discovered. Inside, I found a sealed envelope containing a handwritten letter, along with several other documents Camille had apparently placed there herself, at some point before her death, documents that would fundamentally transform my understanding of everything that had happened to her. I remember my hands trembling as I lifted the small stack of papers from that metal box, a bank employee standing quietly nearby, and I remember asking for a private room before I allowed myself to actually begin reading. Some instinct telling me that whatever I was about to discover deserved a moment of genuine privacy rather than being processed under fluorescent lights with a stranger present. I remember sitting in that small, quiet room the bank provided, the door closed, my own phone silenced, understanding that I needed complete, uninterrupted space to process whatever I was about to read. I remember the specific weight of the envelope in my hands before I opened it, heavier than its actual paper contents likely justified. Evidence, I think now, of exactly how much significance I already sensed it likely carried. I want to share what this handwritten letter actually said, because I have read it countless times in the months since this discovery, and its specific content carries, I think, considerable significance for understanding what Camille was genuinely experiencing during her final months. She wrote, Delphine, if you're ever reading this, it means something happened to me that I was afraid might happen, and I need you to know the truth, whatever anyone else eventually tells you about it. I've been genuinely afraid of Julian for months now, afraid in a way I haven't known how to properly explain to you or anyone else, because I worried you'd tell me to simply leave, and things aren't that simple. Not with him, not with how carefully he's built his own version of our relationship for anyone looking in from the outside. I'm writing this because I want there to be some genuine record, somewhere safe, of what I was actually feeling, in case anything ever happens that doesn't match whatever story eventually gets told. I remember reading this letter alone in that small, private bank room, my own breathing unsteady, understanding, sentence by sentence, that my sister had been quietly, carefully documenting a fear I had sensed, but never fully understood. A fear she had apparently trusted only to this single hidden letter rather than to me directly, understanding, I think, exactly how frightened she genuinely was of what might happen if that fear became visible too soon. I want to describe my reaction to reading this specific letter because it represents a genuine, disorienting recalibration of everything I had believed about Camille's final months. I sat in that quiet bank office, reading this letter repeatedly, understanding that my sister had been experiencing a genuine sustained fear I had never fully recognized, despite my own persistent unease throughout that final year, a fear she had apparently documented deliberately, understanding, with a foresight that now feels almost unbearably prescient, that she might eventually need this record. I want to tell you about the additional documents I found alongside this letter, because understanding their specific content matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Camille had also preserved several handwritten samples of her own genuine handwriting from throughout that final year, along with a brief, dated journal entry describing specific incidents involving Julian that she characterized, in careful, measured language, as deeply frightening and controlling. I remember reading through these additional pages slowly, recognizing, in every line, the actual, specific voice of my sister, her particular phrasing, her specific vocabulary, entirely unlike the generic, impersonal language that had characterized the note originally presented as her final words. I remember understanding, in that specific moment, exactly why my own instinct had never fully quieted throughout the preceding 6 years. Understanding that some part of me had recognized, even without any formal evidence, that the voice in that original note simply wasn't hers. I remember, too, a specific small detail within Camille's journal entry that struck me particularly hard, a brief mention of wanting to call me directly to talk everything through properly, followed by a note that she decided to wait until she felt she could explain things without it turning into something bigger than it needs to be. I understood, reading this, that she had likely been carrying her fear carefully, privately, trying to manage it herself for as long as she reasonably could, exactly the kind of pattern I've since learned is genuinely common among people navigating this specific difficult kind of relationship. I want to tell you about the specific decision I made following this discovery, because understanding my careful, deliberate process matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. I contacted an attorney immediately, understanding that this discovery likely warranted formally reopening the original investigation into Camille's death, given the genuine, substantial new evidence I had just uncovered. I remember my first meeting with this attorney, a careful, experienced woman who specialized in exactly this kind of complex, sensitive matter, bringing with me the entire contents of that safety deposit box, watching her review each document with genuine, focused attention, understanding, from her own careful, measured reaction, exactly how significant this discovery likely was. I remember her explaining, patiently, exactly what steps would need to be taken to formally pursue this discovery, the specific process of retaining a qualified forensic document examiner, the careful documentation required to establish a clear chain of custody for everything I had found, and the realistic timeline I should expect for a case like this to move through the necessary legal channels. I remember appreciating her honesty about how long this process might genuinely take, understanding that pursuing this kind of significant reconsideration required patience alongside determination, rather than any expectation of quick, simple resolution. I want to tell you about the specific forensic analysis that followed, because understanding this careful, professional process matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Working with this attorney, we retained a certified forensic document examiner to formally compare the handwriting in the note originally presented at Camille's death against the genuine handwriting samples I had discovered in her safety deposit box. I remember waiting for this examiner's formal findings with a specific, anxious patience, understanding that whatever conclusion emerged would either confirm my own long-held instinct with genuine, professional authority or would require me to finally, painfully accept the original explanation I had never fully believed, but had also never been able to formally disprove. I want to tell you what this forensic examination eventually revealed, because its findings represent the actual turning point of this entire story. The examiner's formal report concluded that the original note presented as Camille's suicide note showed significant, specific inconsistencies with her genuine handwriting. Inconsistencies in letter formation, stroke pressure, and specific stylistic habits that, taken together, led the examiner to conclude, with considerable professional confidence, that the original note had likely not been written by Camille herself. I remember my attorney walking me through this report carefully, explaining the specific technical language in terms I could genuinely understand, describing how the examiner had identified particular, consistent differences in how certain letters were formed, differences that remained stable across the multiple genuine samples I had provided, but that appeared markedly different in the original note. A pattern the examiner described as considerably more significant than the kind of ordinary variation someone's own handwriting might show under emotional distress. I want to describe my reaction to receiving this specific finding, because understanding my genuine, complicated emotional response matters for everything that eventually happened. I felt, receiving this report, a specific, overwhelming mixture of vindication and profound grief, understanding that my own persistent doubt throughout the preceding 6 years had likely reflected a genuine, accurate instinct, alongside an entirely new, considerably more painful understanding of what my sister may have actually experienced during her final days. I want to tell you about the specific steps my attorney and I took following this forensic finding, because understanding this careful, deliberate process matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. We formally submitted this forensic analysis, along with Camille's own handwritten letter and journal entries, to the original investigating police department, requesting formal reconsideration of the case given this substantial new evidence. I want to describe the department's response to this submission, because understanding their genuine, professional reaction matters for the full resolution of this entire story. The department, reviewing this new documentation carefully, agreed to formally reopen the investigation into Camille's death, assigning a new detective to conduct a considerably more thorough review, given the specific, credible evidence now available that had not existed during the original investigation. I remember the specific phone call informing me of this decision, a genuinely different experience from my earlier attempts to raise concerns years before, this new detective's voice carrying a careful, professional seriousness that felt, finally, like genuine engagement with what I had spent 6 years believing deserved proper attention. I remember thanking her, my own voice catching slightly, understanding that this single phone call represented the first genuine, official acknowledgement that my long-held doubt may have reflected something real. I want to be honest with you about where this reopened investigation currently stands, because I think honesty about this specific ongoing uncertainty matters for the genuine, complete resolution of this story. This investigation remains actively ongoing as of this recording, and I want to be careful not to speculate beyond what has been formally, publicly confirmed, understanding that pursuing genuine justice for Camille requires patience and careful, thorough process, rather than any premature conclusions on my own part. I want to tell you about my own emotional experience throughout this entire process, because understanding this genuine, complicated grief matters for the complete, honest resolution of this story. I do not feel simple, uncomplicated relief, the way you might expect from a story that reveals this kind of significant new evidence. I feel instead something considerably more layered, a specific, renewed grief for my sister that feels, in many ways, even more acute than what I experienced during the initial aftermath of her death, alongside a hard-won, if painful, sense that I am finally, actively working to honor the truth she herself worked so carefully to preserve. I find myself, some days, moving between these two experiences almost minute by minute, a genuine gratitude for finally having credible evidence supporting what I always believed, followed almost immediately by a fresh wave of grief for exactly what that evidence now suggests she may have actually endured during her final months, alone, afraid, and uncertain whether anyone would ever fully understand what she was genuinely experiencing. I want to tell you about the specific choice I made regarding how to share this story, because I think it matters for understanding my own genuine intentions in telling it. I have chosen to share this experience not to make any definitive accusation beyond what a proper, ongoing investigation will eventually determine, but because I believe genuinely, deeply, that Camille's own careful decision to preserve her authentic voice, understanding even then that she might need it, deserves to be honored and shared, regardless of how this specific investigation eventually concludes. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. Trusting your own persistent instincts, even when authorities or circumstances suggest there's nothing further to investigate, is never something to dismiss entirely. My own doubt about that original note never fully quieted throughout 6 years, and that persistent doubt, it turns out, reflected something genuinely, significantly true. Here is a second truth I have carried with me since this discovery. People experiencing genuine fear within a controlling relationship sometimes find remarkably careful, deliberate ways to preserve evidence of their authentic experience, understanding, with a foresight that is both remarkable and heartbreaking, that they may need that evidence someday. Camille's own careful preservation of her genuine handwriting and her honest account of her fear represented an act of extraordinary, quiet courage. Here is a third truth. Professional, credentialed forensic analysis carries a specific kind of authority that personal conviction alone, however genuine, simply cannot provide. My own 6 years of persistent doubt never once carried sufficient weight to reopen this case, but a single formal forensic document examination did. Here is a fourth truth. Grief and the pursuit of truth are not always sequential experiences, one following cleanly after the other. I am still, actively, in the midst of both simultaneously, understanding that genuine healing and genuine justice sometimes require an uncomfortable, ongoing patience rather than any single complete resolution arriving all at once. Here is a fifth truth, one I have only begun to understand in recent months. Reopening a painful chapter of grief, even in pursuit of genuine truth, does not simply layer new pain on top of old pain in some straightforward, additive way. It reshapes the entire experience, requiring you to grieve, in some sense, all over again, but with a clearer, if considerably more difficult, understanding of what you're actually grieving. And here is the last truth I want to leave you with. Sometimes the people we love leave behind careful, deliberate evidence of their genuine truth, trusting that someone, someday, will find it and understand exactly what they were quietly trying to preserve, even when circumstances prevented them from saying it clearly and directly while they still had the chance to do so themselves. That is my story, as it currently, honestly stands. 6 years of persistent, unresolved doubt, one unexpected bank notification, and one forensic analysis that has finally reopened a case I never stopped believing deserved a considerably more thorough, honest investigation. I think, sometimes, about the specific courage it must have taken Camille to write that hidden letter, understanding, even as she wrote it, that she was documenting a fear she felt she couldn't yet speak aloud to the people who loved her most. I think about her sitting somewhere, alone, choosing her words carefully, understanding that she was creating a record she genuinely hoped no one would ever actually need to find. I carry that image with me now, alongside my grief, understanding it as its own quiet, specific evidence of exactly how much she loved the people she left behind, even in the midst of whatever fear she was privately carrying. I visit her grave regularly now, considerably more often than I did during those first uncertain years, and I tell her, each time, that I am still working to understand and honor whatever truth she was trying to protect. I don't know yet exactly where this reopened investigation will lead, and I have made peace, as much as I genuinely can, with not having that answer yet. What I do have, finally, after 6 years, is the certainty that my own instinct was never simply grief clouding my judgment, but something considerably more real, something Camille herself had quietly, carefully worked to ensure I would eventually find. If this story meant something to you, I would ask something different of you than I have in other stories I've shared. If you are currently experiencing fear within your own relationship, of any kind, please know that your own instinct to document what you are genuinely experiencing, safely and carefully, matters. And that reaching out to a domestic violence support organization or a trusted professional can help you build exactly the kind of safety plan that protects you, rather than leaving you to navigate that fear entirely alone. If this helped you tonight, a simple like lets me know these stories are genuinely worth continuing to tell. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next story. I want to add one final note before I go. This particular story touches on subjects that are genuinely difficult: domestic fear, sudden loss, and unresolved grief. If anything in this story felt close to your own experience, and you are struggling, please know that support exists, and that you deserve access to it.